Gospel lesson today comes from the book of Luke, chapter 14, verses 25 through 33. Please rise in spirit or in body for the reading of the gospel. Large crowds were traveling with Jesus. Turning to them, he said, "Whoever comes to me and doesn't hate father and mother, spouse and children, and brothers and sisters, yes, even one's own life, cannot be my disciple. Whoever doesn't carry their own cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. If one of you wanted to build a tower, wouldn't you first sit down and calculate the cost to determine whether you have enough money to complete it? Otherwise, when you laid the foundation but couldn't finish the tower, all who see it will begin to belittle you. They will say, 'Here's the person who began construction and couldn't complete it.' Or what king would go to war against another king without first sitting down to consider whether his 10,000 soldiers could go up against the 20,000 coming against him? And if he didn't think he could win, he would send a representative to discuss terms of peace while his enemy was still a long way off. In the same way, none of you who are unwilling to give up all of your possessions can be my disciple." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. Almighty God, may the words of my mouth and indeed the meditation of all of our heart be acceptable to you, our strength and our redeemer. Amen. You may be seated. So I spent this weekend with Paige, as I normally do, but I spent it teaching licensing school for the new local pastors in Mississippi. I am sometimes tapped because I am obsessive about Methodism. I am tapped to teach the kind of introduction to Methodism class for our local pastors. And what I do and what we do is we talk about what it means to, of course, we talk about the history of the church and the history of the Methodist movement, but we also kind of go through a very, I guess you could say, basic, here's what it means to be a Christian, here's what we believe, here's what we believe when we are a Methodist, and that's fun for me. I like doing that. But what always catches me about Methodism, and this whole sermon is not going to be about Methodism, don't worry, but what always catches me about Methodism is how our whole system is set up to not just believe the correct things, though that's important, but it's to push us, to guide us, to pull us sometimes into a life of discipleship. We are not just about being orthodox or having right belief. We are about doing the right things, or being having orthopraxy, doing the things that make us disciples, following Jesus. Our entire theology is kind of built around forming us into those kind of disciples. But oftentimes, when we think about what it is that makes a person a Christian, what is it that makes someone a Christian, we think about, you have to believe these things. And again, that's important. But too often it kind of translates for us as, are you angry about the right things? But it seems to me, when I read the words of Jesus, that he seemed to be at least as concerned about what we do, not just what we think or how we act. Jesus calls disciples. To be a disciple means to walk in someone's footsteps, to follow them, to be formed by them. And so for the next 12 weeks, yes, 12 weeks, we're going to be talking about and discussing what it means to be a disciple. We're going to be discussing what disciples do. Now, don't think that there's some kind of hidden message in any of this. It's not. Jesus is really upfront about what's going on here. As I read the gospel passage today, I kept thinking about all of the terms of service that we sign every time we buy something or subscribe to something. When we get cable or satellite, when we sign up for Netflix or Hulu or Disney Plus, which is coming and I'm very excited about it. When we get a new phone, when we buy a house, when we rent an apartment, when we sign up for college, there is usually just these page after page after page of, read this first and make sure that you sign it or make sure that you click that you've read it. And how many of you actually do that before you sign it? How many of you read everything? I'm going to admit it, I don't. Not many of you do, a couple of you do. But I don't. I just, say, oh, it's fine, whatever. I'm sure I'm not signing it with my soul or my firstborn to anybody. I think Samsung, owns my house at this point, but I don't know. But it's often in fine print, and they kind of trust that you're not going to read the whole thing. But that's not what Jesus does. Jesus is very upfront about terms of service. Jesus is very upfront about what you are signing up for when you decide that you want to become his disciple. And I'm not going to lie, I don't like it. He says, as large crowds are following him, have shown up. Large crowds. Now this is the time when any self-respecting preacher would think, man, I have made it. I've got large crowds here with me. This is great. What we need to do here is we need to get some programs set up to make sure that everybody's kind of comfortable. We'll have a small group or a Sunday school class for young families, and we'll have one for young adults, and we'll have one for older folks, and we'll have one for middle-aged folks, and whatever. And we're going to make sure that everybody's really comfortable and finds a good place for themselves. But instead, he turns around to these crowds who are following him, who are waiting to hear what he has to say, and he says, well, so if you want to be my disciple, oh yeah, Jesus, that's exactly what we want to be. If you want to be my disciple, you've got to hate your family. You got to hate your mom and your dad. You got to hate your wife or your husband. You got to hate your brothers and your sisters. You got to hate your kids. You got to hate everybody. Well, I'm going to the bathroom and I'll be right back, I promise. I would say. Just kind of slip out the back of the crowd. Hope nobody notices that I've left. Hate your parents, hate your family, hate your children, hate your wife, hate your husband. Oh, no. That doesn't sound right. Is this the same Jesus who told us to love our enemies and now he's telling us to hate our loved ones? That's not what I want to hear. But I want you to hear what those who were listening in the first century would have heard. Your family, even more than it is now, was your social support network. Your family was how you identified yourself, as it really still is, often. If you were a person without a family, you were not someone who could enter into social life. You couldn't be a business person. You couldn't be someone who basically signed contracts. Some people had to know who your family was. And then he goes on and he says, well, I want you to know that if you want to be my disciple, you've got to carry your cross. And this is not what he's not talking about how we often use it, which is, it's just this thing that I'm having to live with, I'm sick, or I've got a bad relationship with my family, or this or that. No, but when Jesus is talking about carrying the cross, he's being fairly literal about that because, it's what he ends up doing. And if you are a Christian in those first couple of centuries, if you are really trying to be a disciple of Jesus Christ, there is a good chance at this point in time that two things are going to happen. That your family, the people who give you your identity, are going to turn away from you. They're going to say, no, we will not have a disciple of this Galilean rabbi in our house. We will not claim you anymore. And there was a good chance that you were going to end up dead by the Roman government's hands, probably by crucifixion. So when Jesus is saying, like, you've got to hate your family, and you've got to carry your cross, he's talking to people who are going to be abandoned by their families, and he is talking to people who are going to have to carry a cross. In other words, to be a disciple of Jesus Christ, you are going to have to be willing to sacrifice everything about your life, including your life itself. You have to be willing to be all in. Because there are no half measures, he is saying. There is no being kind of a disciple of Jesus Christ. There is being a disciple or not being a disciple. So, he says, do you still want to sign up? It's not about, when Jesus says to hate your family, to hate your spouse, to hate your brother and your sister, he's not telling us to have evil thoughts about them. He is not telling us to reject them. He is giving comfort to those who will be rejected by their families. Jesus in this moment is claiming us. All of us who desire to be his disciples. He is claiming us. He's claiming our relationships. He's claiming our stuff. He's claiming our life. This is serious business. No half measures. If you're going to do this, Jesus says, if you're going to do this, let me lay out the consequences for you. I am going to be, Jesus says, I'm going to be, and I have to be your priority. Otherwise there just is no way to follow me. And look, I say this as someone who has a lot of other stuff going on in his life. I don't hate my wife, Paige, don't worry.
Thanks, son.
You're welcome. I'm on record. I'm on video saying that now. As a Southern boy, for someone to tell me to hate my mama is just the worst thing you can say to me. But he is claiming us. He is claiming our priority. Because, look, we like our choices, don't we? We like to say, look, I've got so many different things and I want to be able to pick and choose. And I mean, yeah, Jesus is great and my faith is great, but I'll put that time in when I don't have much else to do. I don't have anything else on Sunday, or I don't have anything else on whatever, and I've got other stuff going on, but I promise I'll get around to it when it's not inconvenient for me. But what Jesus says is it's not about convenience. This is about making Christ and being a disciple of Christ your priority in your life. And this was good news for those who heard it the first time. Those who were about to find out that they could not count on their family. They could not count on their possessions. They could not even count on their own lives. So all of these things that were supposed to be the most important things in their lives, family, possessions, life itself, they were not permanent. They could go. They could leave you at any moment. But Jesus says, in this moment, God has claimed you. God has said, you are mine. You belong to me. And all else in this world might fail you, but God never will fail you. God will never give up on you. God will never abandon you. God will never turn away from you. And so when we take our faith seriously, when we make this our priority, what we're doing is we're putting our energy into that which will never fail us, instead of putting our energy and our time and our efforts into that which will. And don't think that this is something that was just applicable a couple of thousand years ago. We still live in a world where everything can and is impermanent, whether we like to admit it or not. Our families may reject us. It happens, for whatever reason. We may lose all that we own. We may find that we have nothing. We may find that we're sick. And our lives are not going to be as long as we think they will be. All the things that we thought we could count on, they'll fail us. They may not mean to, but they will. But God, you see, has claimed each of us as God's own child. God has said, "You are mine." You may be considered poor by the world's standards. You may be considered useless by the world's standards. You may be considered as nothing by everyone else. But to God, you are a treasure beyond reckoning. To God, you matter more than the stars in the heavens. Your life may be finite, but Christ offers eternal life. When all else fails us, God does not. And so, yes, in this moment, God, through Christ, simply asks for everything that we have. To give to God our relationships, our possessions, even our very lives. But it's not because God is being some kind of possessive jerk. It's because God desires to give us a life lived with God. And before we can take God's promises in our hands, we have to set down everything else that we're holding. We're called to be serious about our faith because God is serious about us. Because God has claimed us. And because God will never fail you. I ask you now to spend a few moments just kind of thinking about what is it that is getting in the way of you taking your